You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 37, Juliet. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Earl Green.
And I'm Ashley Thomas, sitting in for Norman Lau.
Each week on Gene-ology, we revisit Gene Roddenberry's early TV writing, looking for any hints of the morals, meanings, and messages that he later worked into his most famous creation, Star Trek. Who knows when and where we'll find those?
Wherefore art thou, messages? Earl will be back with trivia in a moment, but first, here's how you can reach us. Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also just the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on X, formerly known as Twitter, and Facebook at missionlogpod. While you're at it, leave us a review and rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. And please remember, your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. And now, this week's trivia. Take it away, Earl.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Juliet is episode 20 of the second season of Have Gun, Will Travel, and is Gene's third script for the season. It aired on January 31st, 1959, so we're getting close to the 5th anniversary of Gene's first professional TV writing credit. And in 1959, all of Gene's screen credits came from Have Gun, though he was also writing pitches for series projects of his own at the time, one of which would make it to the air in 1960, very briefly. But as far as his on-screen credits were concerned, Gene spent 59 writing exclusively for Have Gun, Will Travel. Playing the part of Juliet Harper is Miranda Jones. The character is eventually revealed to be 17, but Miranda was 24 when the episode was filmed. She went on to appear as a different character in the third season, also putting in appearances in The Twilight Zone and Gunsmoke, and we will catch up with her a few years later in her career when she appears in an early episode of Gene's series, The Lieutenant, in 1963. But Miranda's career and her life were cut short at the age of 38. We lost her in 1973. It may or may not be a coincidence that Miranda's name would grace a prominent character played by Diana Muldaur in the Star Trek episode Is There in Truth No Beauty in 1968, the same episode that brought us the Medusans. The actor playing Colonel Jeremiah Pike was Earl Hodgins, an actor with a long history in the Western genre, with appearances in such films as Oregon Trail and Heroes of the Alamo, and TV guest roles in Gunsmoke, The Twilight Zone, and The Donna Reed Show. This episode of Have Gun is an early career entry for actor Alan Case, who played Ted Pike, and then played a completely different role just 10 episodes later. The irony of this will become apparent later in today's show, but Alan starred as Frank James in the series The Legend of Jesse James, and would go on to an even longer run starring alongside Henry Fonda in the Norman Lear co-created western The Deputy, which premiered later in 1959 and ran for 2 seasons. In the Have Gun, Will Travel Companion, a book by Martin Grams and Les Rayburn, there's a quote from stuntman Hal Needham about this episode. When we got to the thing where the girl and I jumped from the runaway coach, they were kind of just moping along and I didn't go out, and they asked, "Why didn't you go out?" I said, "Well, you were going so slow, I thought it was a rehearsal." And Boone said, "That's the kind of a stuntman I want. Back that thing up and bring him through like there's no tomorrow." And they did. Act 1. Paladin and his horse make a stop at the Circle T Ranch, a place that looks like it's seen better days, especially once he notices 2 very fresh graves on the property. As he heads for the front door to knock, shots ring out, and 2 men approach and disarm him, asking what his business is there. They want to know if he's come to see Juliet. After all, the 2 men just buried her aunt and uncle, and it sounds like they have a score to settle with her as well. After all, they're the Pikes. She's a Harper. As if that explains everything. The sound of another rider approaching distracts the Pike boys, and Paladin puts up a brief fight before they knock him out. While Paladin is out cold, the other men confer. The new arrival is Colonel Pike, and he's clearly in charge of his younger kinfolk. He decides that Paladin will be no threat to them if he has no weapons or transport. Leave him alive. After Paladin awakens, he heads back to the road to try to flag down a coach or a passing rider with money in hand. And sure enough, here comes a coach, but they're not stopping for anyone. Paladin has to dive out of the way before the horses run him over. The coach navigates a sharp turn and starts downhill, where Paladin is waiting to jump onto the coach. He punches and disarms the man riding shotgun and tells the driver to stop the coach. The driver didn't stop for Paladin because they're afraid of running into Colonel Pike or his family. Paladin's familiar with that name. Colonel Pike headed up the Confederate irregulars, and there's a price on his head in both the northern and southern states. The driver assumed Paladin was working for the Pikes, especially since the lone passenger in the coach is none other than Juliet Harper herself. Paladin offers to settle his fare in the next town and climbs into the coach, finding that even Juliet is armed and ready to defend herself. Paladin promises he means her no harm. Juliet says she's 18, but Paladin guesses she's actually 17. He's trying to gently ease into the subject of what's happened to her aunt and uncle, but Juliet has already guessed. They're dead. Just like her parents, who were trying to save enough money to move out of this area with Juliet and her brother. Her brother apparently got away safely and settled down in Hawaii and sent her a message to come join him. Paladin is trying to distract Juliet with some fun facts about Hawaii when shots ring out again, forcing them to hit the deck in the coach. The Pike boys are back, and they're gaining fast. Paladin tells Juliet to get ready to take a flying leap out of the coach. They're going to have to make a run for it, and that means he needs to ditch the heels. They survive the jump, and the Pikes continue chasing the coach, but once they catch up and realize it's empty, they will double back looking for Juliet and Paladin, so they have to keep moving. Act 2. Paladin and Juliet happen upon an unoccupied house and set up camp for the night. Paladin uses blankets to block any view through the windows, and Juliet, well, she's dead tired. Paladin carries her to the bed and tucks her in, not even waking her in the process. In the morning, Paladin already has breakfast laid out for Juliet, though it's gone cold while she slept, and he can't risk starting a fire to warm it up. Understandably, for someone who has armed killers after him, Paladin didn't exactly sleep well, and he's eager to dispel any romantic notions Juliet may be having about them being stuck together, and that's okay because she says she wasn't even thinking about that. Paladin tries to get some kind of useful local knowledge from Juliet, such as whose house they're squatting in. She says it belongs to the Johnsons, and Mr. Johnson was a Union artilleryman in the war. But why are there Confederate decorations on the wall? When he hears horses outside, Paladin puts it together. The Pikes forced the Johnsons out of their home, and now they're back. Paladin and Juliet hurriedly try to cover their tracks and leave no signs that they've been there, but an open window is a telltale sign to the Pikes that someone was just there. Act 3. Paladin and Juliet have been sheltering in the loft of the Johnsons' barn, keeping an eye on the Pikes occupying the house. There's been no sign of Colonel Jeremiah Pike, which suits Juliet just fine. He is the one she's most afraid of. Paladin tries to reassure Juliet and maybe distract her a bit, telling her about his line of work, though she doesn't actually believe him. She thinks he's talking himself up. There's a frank discussion on the differences between being a girl and being a woman, and finally Juliet says they should get some rest, and then plants a kiss on Paladin's cheek. It's a very short sleep. Colonel Jeremiah Pike has returned from trying to follow the tracks of his prey. He and his boys decide to check the barn. Before opening the door, Jeremiah shouts an offer to Paladin. "Give up. Don't die for the girl's sake." But Jeremiah's instructions to his nephews are clear. He wants both Paladin and Juliet dead. The first of the Pike boys to enter the barn falls right into Paladin's trap and is lynched on the spot. Jeremiah and his remaining nephew now plan to burn down the barn with Paladin and Juliet still in it. Paladin makes a flying leap out of the hayloft and knocks out Pike's other nephew, taking his gun back. But at the same time, Jeremiah climbs into the loft and corners Juliet. Paladin distracts Jeremiah long enough to take the colonel down with a single shot. Terrified at everything that has just transpired, Juliet is, understandably, a tearful mess. Later, back at the Hotel Carlton in San Francisco, Paladin watches as Juliet, all cleaned up and looking like a lady out on the town, descends the stairs. He hands her a ticket, a one-way trip via ship to Hawaii, where she'll be safe. She asks if Paladin will come to Hawaii someday, and promises not to even so much as look at another man in the meantime. Paladin gives her a kiss, but makes no promises other than that he's arranged for Juliet to dine at the captain's table on the trip to the islands. The handsome young third officer arrives to escort Juliet to the ship, and it's clear that she's a bit taken with him, and vice versa. As they leave, Hey Boy arrives to ask Paladin if he's all right. And Paladin will be. After all, he's got plans with someone else this evening, someone a bit older. The end.
Thank you very much for that excellent recap, as always, Earl.
Well, I tried. I tried to jump on that coach and just hang on for dear life through the whole ride. It's a bit of a rough one.
But you did it. No stuntman required.
There is, thank goodness for that. There's a lot of action in this one. It's when it slows down that I start worrying about what's going on in this story. But speaking of the action, that dive where Paladin is trying, he's waving dollars in front of any passing coach, then has to dive out of the way because those guys are not stopping because they know they have someone on their tail already. That was Richard Boone. That was not Hal Needham. I could not spot an edit or a swap out there, and so that really is him waiting until the last minute to dive out from front of that coach. I looked very carefully because I thought, okay, when he dives into the tall grass, he's going to disappear and then come up, and then that's Richard Boone, and the previous guy was Hal Needham. No, he never disappears.
Admire anybody who can do their own stunts.
Yeah, they presumably have a lot better insurance than the rest of us.
Right.
Now, there was a reference to Pike being worse than Quantrill, and I kind of had an inkling, sort of a vague memory as to which Quantrill they were mentioning here, so I went to refresh my memory, and sure enough, it is a reference to William Quantrill, who led a group of Confederate sympathizers known as Quantrill's Raiders in the early 1860s during the Civil War. Quantrill was granted a field commission to the Confederate Army under the Partisan Ranger Act, and so he was indeed a Confederate irregular, although he became the reason the Confederacy stopped making use of that rule. He gave himself the rank of colonel and led bloody guerrilla raids on Union supply lines, particularly along the Kansas-Missouri border, because the recently opened territory was up for grabs by both abolitionists and those who had no intention of giving up being slave owners. In August of 1863, and this would have been about a decade before the time frame of Have Gun Will Travel, Quantrill and his raiders attacked the city of Lawrence, Kansas, and killed 180 citizens of Lawrence, Kansas. Included in the men under Quantrill's command were Jesse and Frank James. And much like Jesse James, Quantrill was somewhat inexplicably romanticized into a hero after his death in 1864. There's a lot more to the story than that. That's kind of a capsule history. Neither side in the Civil War was necessarily being civil, so I'm not really sure why they call it that. I'm with George Carlin on that. Civil War makes no sense as a phrase. After the fall of the Confederacy and the dissolution of Quantrill's Raiders, most of his surviving men got in line behind Jesse James and joined that gang. But it is true that after the Lawrence, Kansas massacre, Quantrill lost all support. You've got to be a real menace to every living thing around you for both sides of the Civil War to agree that you are no good to either of them. And so by mentioning Quantrill, that gives us some context as to who Jeremiah Pike is. We know why Juliet is afraid of them, but especially afraid of him. Her talk of her parents seeking a better life and a better education for their children makes it seem likely that the Harpers were Northerners who were trying to make a new start and then decided, you know what, not here. And the Pikes, being lumped in with Quantrill's Raiders by association, were Confederate irregulars who are now out to settle their own scores, and they're trying to relitigate the Civil War in blood, preferably other people's. So, Interesting, but really dark historical footnote there.
That's rough. I didn't know any of that. Also, frankly, I don't think I mean, I am not a history buff by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't think I realized Jesse James was a real person. So,
well, that's a fair point. And here's the thing: Quantrill's Raiders have been referenced in many movies and TV shows, including episodes of Bonanza and Gunsmoke and Little House on the Prairie, if you can believe that. So, at some point, this was a known thing from history that people were kind of culturally expected to know. Well, I'll give you another example. True Grit. Rooster Cogburn claims that he was formerly one of Quantrill's irregulars. It's like, wait...
I missed
It's
that.
like, wait a minute. Well, I thought we were supposed to be rooting for Rooster here.
Right. Does he mention this in both versions?
Yes, it's in both
Okay.
the John Wayne and the Bridges version.
Okay. Went over my head both times. But it's also a name I didn't recognize either, so...
The thing about Quantrill and Jesse James is that they've both been heavily romanticized in absentia. I'm not sure I'll really ever understand that. But it's a thing that happens.
Well, there's a friend of mine who is much more of a history buff than me. There's like a whole slew that if I try to go into detail, I'm going to get stuff wrong. But basically, a lot of the rebranding, if you will, of the Confederacy happened as a result of the Daughters of Confederacy, like the efforts of that. So that's why we have so many Confederate statues and different, alternate histories. Well, blah, blah, blah happened and blah, blah, blah. Actually, this is why we did it, not because we thought it was cool to own people.
It would be so easy to disappear down the whole rabbit hole, especially where I live. You have people flying Confederate flags on their trucks as if, somehow that's their fight. And I'll get back to that later because I actually thought this was one of the more fascinating footnotes of the story. As I mentioned in trivia, Miranda Jones was 24 when she played Juliet in this episode. And I was so relieved to find that out because one of the first notes I took watching this the first time was that Juliet is the most 20-something looking 18-year-old or 17-year-old I've ever seen. She's the exact opposite of Uncle Roy.
Right. It's interesting. I have friends with daughters that are high school age, and they look older than I do. And I was like, but not in a bad way. I mean, I'm not saying, oh gosh, they look old. Like they've seen better days. But no, it's because YouTube exists and they know how to put on makeup. So, but yeah, I'm watching this is like, okay, I could see how she could maybe be 17, 18, but she's definitely not. You're not looking real closely, but they didn't have YouTube back then. Everybody was what age they said they were, and you didn't ask questions.
Yeah, they didn't have, iPhone filters did not exist at this point in history.
Right.
Which, that would be a way for Paladin to save some money sending out all those business cards. Just airdrop the business card to everyone. Hey, Have Gun Will Travel. In that same scene, I'm not sure how I feel about Paladin's observations on, quote-unquote, the female of the species aging herself up. It may have been a fairly innocuous thing to write in 1958. Hearing that today, it sounds like something you would hear out of some blogger in the manosphere. And, I don't know, it's a turn of phrase that has acquired more ick over time and not less ick. Yeah. Kind of had to check myself there. It's like, okay, this was written in 1958. I want to say you didn't necessarily have that kind of thought then, and yet you have to recognize that kind of thought now for what it is. It's a throwback. So maybe I'm wrong there. Maybe I'm trying too hard to be forgiving of elements of the script, but that turn of phrase just kind of set off a few red flags for me.
Of course, it was certainly more commonplace then, but now it feels more othering.
Yeah. It's like, okay, we're not even going to refer to her as a person. She's the female of the species. Really? Paladin? Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, here is a bit of extra trivia. Paladin's fondness for Hawaii is a bit of an in-joke because Richard Boone himself was in love with Hawaii. When he was done working on Have Gun Will Travel, and with the very short-lived Richard Boone show that followed it, he moved his family to Hawaii for the rest of the 1960s. That's where they lived full-time. Although he moved to Florida in the 70s and stayed there for the rest of his life, Richard Boone did return to Hawaii one last time. And that's where his ashes were scattered in the Pacific, off the coast of Oahu. All of that fondness for Hawaii, no acting required. I mean, that was just Boone being Boone. It feels like he and Gene may have had a conversation, and Gene decided to make use of that information.
It very easily could have been an ad-lib there, too, I think. I don't know how off-script people went back in the olden days, but, if he loves Hawaii that much, you could definitely tell. There's a bit of romanticism in his voice.
Yeah. And the other thing is, Boone was effectively the showrunner. The executive producer of Have Gun, there were numerous people who were nominally in that role, but as far as clout went, Boone could make or break careers of people being on his show, including Gene Roddenberry's. But it turns out he was very fond of Gene, and I feel like he and Gene rubbed off on each other in terms of their worldview. And so I believe these were two people, two kindred spirits who both came at this very much to the left, where most men of that era would land politically. And so they just kind of reinforced each other. I mean, they formed a friendship there, and that has a lot to do with why Gene came back to write for this show so much.
Before we move on to Act 2, Earl, just a very silly observation. When at the opening of the episode, Paladin rides up. He happens to get to the Circle T Ranch. He sees some fresh graves. Because my brain is silly, all I could think of was strange things are afoot at the Circle T. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure what he was doing there. We really have no context for what he was doing there. He says he was just passing through. So maybe he was looking for a place to stop for the night. Maybe this is another case where he is coming back from another job. Because he did have a big wad of bills to wave at the coach that did not stop for him.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a lot like the previous episode we covered where he's heading back to San Fran. Wants to know if it's okay to camp out somewhere, and I don't know. I think upon spotting the freshly dug graves, and we're talking about above ground graves, these people did not get a proper burial. They were dumped and covered. Maybe it's just me. I would be moving on.
Yeah. It's one of those. You see it, nope, and you take a hike. But that's we've said before. Does Paladin really have a plan? And here I don't feel like he really had a plan. He's like, He's like, well, let me go check it out. I was like, no, dude, you go. You run.
Yeah, it's like, okay, that Motel 6 you passed a while back, that's looking really promising right now.
Not this case, apparently.
Yeah.
So.
No, I did notice that once Paladin and Juliet are kind of squatting in the Johnson house, he starts redecorating immediately. I'm glad to see that Paladin is a fellow fan of the blackout curtain.
The blackout curtains are great. As somebody who is pretty sensitive to light at nighttime, the blackout curtains help me get what bit of sleep I do get. Yeah. So. Thank you.
Now, the funny thing about that scene, though, is that, and I know that this was filmed with the limitations of 1950s, 1960s television hardware in mind. While he is putting up that blackout curtain, I couldn't help but notice the interior of that house is way overlit. It is seriously overlit. It should not be that bright in there. Electric lights aren't a thing yet. And then it gets weird, because Paladin comes out with the line, "The fact that you and I are here alone together does not make this a romantic interlude." I'm glad that Juliet called Paladin out on this the moment it left his mouth, because the way Juliet was played, I really did not think that she was thinking of this predicament in any kind of romantic light. Now, it becomes a thing later, but only after this is said. And so, I don't know if we were dealing with maybe revisions were made to the script halfway through, or perhaps there was some directorial note that was not passed on to the actress, but it did not seem at that point like she was going all moon-eyed over Paladin. I thought that was kind of weird.
Right. Yeah, and you know, maybe the only episodes of Have Gun I've watched are the ones we've covered together thus far. But so far, Paladin has a track record of pretty much every woman that meets him throws herself at him. So maybe he's just like, oh, I know I just have this irresistible charm, but just so you know, FYI, pro tip, this is not happening. But even so, like, bro, she's not even, like, made advances at you. That's a little bit arrogant.
Yeah, it seems like a line that maybe could have come up later and made sense, but at this point in the story, it just doesn't make sense. And it partly because of how Juliet is being played. You get no inkling that she's thinking anything like that. Now, we find out later, once we get into the hayloft, oh yeah, she's thinking like that. But the way it's introduced is kind of, I don't know, it reminds me of something that my mother would have called bass-ackwards.
I like the expression.
In that second act, we find a straw doll in the hayloft that was apparently left by one of the Johnson kids while they were playing up there. Juliet simultaneously clings to it and also says that, oh no, I'm too old for things like this. In Act 3, Paladin throws the doll to distract Jeremiah Pike and uses that moment of distraction to kill Jeremiah. And at that point, it seems like the doll, okay, now it is a not at all subtle symbolic representation of loss of innocence, because of all of this trauma and all of this stuff that Juliet has witnessed. I almost wish that they had pursued that rather than the weird and legally questionable age-wise romance angle. Because yes. Juliet has seen a lot in her years. I mean, the implication is that she saw her parents die. She is not at all surprised to hear that her aunt and uncle have been killed. She's going to have psychological scars from this. And I would rather that the story fixated on that loss of innocence rather than anything else that seems to be implied by the script.
Yeah, I do wish they had pursued that a little better. Because, I mean, even on the stagecoach, when she first meets Paladin, she says, I've seen more death at 17 than most women at 70.
Yeah.
So, she's experienced a lot of harshness. And in this same scene, where they're hiding up in the hay, Paladin says, I wrote the line down because I thought it was a good line, good judgment is forced upon us by age and experience. Like, could they have, I mean, it's still, sketchy, but, if they had leaned into the experience angle a little more, then maybe that would make it less sketchy, but I don't think they did, because he says in the same scene, you're not a woman. And it's not you're not a woman in the LOS sense, it's you're not a woman as in you are under the legal age. Which back then I think would have been 21.
I tried to do some digging to try to figure out, of course, it's very dependent on location. Like they say in the disclaimers, laws vary from state to state. But trying to figure out what either the age of consent or the marriageable age, which are two different things, frequently, would have been where they were, was kind of hampered by not really knowing where they were. Because they mention a place name a couple of times, as far as it being a county, and I can find no indication of an actual county in any state by that name. It is a place name of a city in both Arizona and Nevada. Or, as I'm sure someone will let me know, it's supposed to be Nevada. But, just come at me. It's It's an old habit, sorry. But not knowing where they were, not knowing what the local laws were, which sometimes the laws were really backward back then in some places. I mean, in some states, they considered 12 a marriageable age for girls. Which, you know, you think about that now, and it's just beyond the pale. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole element, and this is going to turn up again in my discussion notes. There is a whole sketchy element to this show that I kind of wish hadn't been there, because it's far more interesting to me if we deal with Juliet as someone who has seen a lot of things that no one her age should ever have seen. You know, when Paladin gets into the coach, she's ready to stab him. That implies that she has either had to do that before, or has had to prepare herself and steel herself for that before. Either way, that's quite a thing. That's not something you should have to do at the age of 17, is fend off someone in close quarters combat with a knife. It's weird that the script keeps focusing on a more lurid read on the concept of loss of innocence, rather than examining a more serious take on that is right there waiting to be explored. And perhaps this is, again, the limitations of 26 minutes of TV. It seems like there's not enough meat on the bones to stretch this story out to an hour. But if you could, I feel like that would be what would fill that space, that examination.
Yeah, and the episode kind of flits between those two. Like, she's seen some things versus she may or may not be an adult. It's like it can't decide what it wants to do.
Yeah.
And then towards the end, it's almost like, I am 17 going on.
That song in my head, too. Thank you.
Yeah. You know, but it's basically played for laughs there at the end versus, oh, this is kind of sketchy. Paladin, you need to, you know, behave. But, you know, I've got some more thoughts, but I'll save that for when we get to the end.
Yeah, because there's all kinds of sketchy going on here.
Yeah,
we'll discuss that more coming up. All right, Ashley, there was Romeo and Juliet, there were Hatfields and McCoys. Now apparently there are Pikes and Harpers and a dash of Civil War context. But really it's not hard to figure out where the inspiration for this episode comes from. There is some American history set dressing that does some narrative heavy lifting. But you don't have to work too hard to trace a character named Juliet straight back to Shakespeare. Because it's the name of the episode. They are on a hiding to nothing, as the Brits say. Mm-hmm. But there is something about this version of the story that still kind of skeeves me out just a little bit, as the kids say. We are told that Juliet is 17. Now, this episode aired mere days after Richard Boone's 42nd birthday. So, on film, Boone, and presumably Paladin, is 41 years old. Now, he looks a lot older, but people's habits and the state of medical science back then kind of allowed for you to have someone 41 years old who looked like he had maybe a few more years on the odometer, or indeed, perhaps a 17-year-old who looks like she's in her mid-20s. But still, okay, so we are told what her age is. That's an alarming age spread. But once you factor in that Juliet is supposed to be a minor, it becomes an illegal age spread. Right. And I'm a little weirded out that we keep fixating on that, on age rather than experience. It's like the script has made the decision to focus on the most lurid take on Juliet's experience versus inexperience possible. Whereas there was a much more interesting angle to mine for story right there. It's right there. It's even commented on, and then they drop it.
I mentioned the quote earlier, good judgment is forced upon us by age and experience. Okay, well, Juliet doesn't have the age, but she sure as heck does have the experience. And I don't say that to justify any weird, sketchy relationship between them. But Paladin waffles from treating her like a child to, like, yes, but I'm also attracted to you. I'm like, dude, that's just really weird. And as a woman, that creeps me out a lot. And so for me, watching this, I just like,
well,
the whole time.
Have you noticed that in Hollywood, this flows in one direction?
Yes. It's only very recently starting to circle back the other direction. I mean, I haven't watched it, but there's a movie right now. It's supposed to be a romance movie with Nicole Kidman and Zac Efron as the leads.
I'm thinking of about 20 years ago, there was a movie where we spend the whole movie with Sean Connery, practically a senior citizen at that point, already at that point, fawning over Catherine Zeta-Jones for the whole movie. I forget what movie it is. And look, I understand a May-December romance can be a thing, because I am the product of such a relationship. My parents had a nearly 20-year age difference. So obviously that can work, but they were both consenting adults. And so it's hard to let this script off the hook because it keeps fixating on will they, won't they, when, the back of my head is shouting at me, but they shouldn't. And then it gets really weird at the end because, Paladin has spent the whole episode barely rebuffing Juliet's advances. But then we get one of these weird twists in the home stretch, and I refer to this personally as the Chasing Amy effect, where, you were good for about the first 95% of the story, and then you get hit something right at the end that's like, what? And we discover that he's expecting to spend his evening in the company of the red-headed woman, who he just told Juliet was practically ancient at 24 years old. Okay. 24, 41. I don't know.
If she's practically ancient, what does that make
exactly? Sense? I mean, wow. And he tells Hey Boy, that he will end the evening in the company of this 24-year-old woman feeling, and I quote, less noble but much better. This is the kind of writing that gets you pretty maids all in a row, which is a 1971 movie that Gene wrote that goes further in this direction. And believe me, when we get to discussing that movie on this podcast, there will be a content warning on that one. But it's just trying to parse that last piece of information where I get so confused. And it's almost like, okay, so what is this wistful look on Paladin's face in those final scenes? Is he perhaps rethinking his current relationship in light of everything he's just been through with Juliet? Like, you know what, 24 is not that old either. But then we don't play it that way. It's like, oh, hey, the implication is he's going to go wine and dine this 24-year-old redhead, and there's going to be some action that we can't discuss on 50s TV. Something to fly over the heads of the kids in the audience, but, mom and dad will be looking at each other in their recliners and going, well, I don't know where to come down on this. Help me, please.
Honestly, my friend, I don't know that I have a whole lot of things to add other than, like, she's like, oh, I'll be 18 in July. And then he's like, well, happy birthday. I'm like, what the heck? Dude, grody.
And here's the other thing. Okay, so about that last scene, he gives her a big kiss that she looks like she doesn't really know what to do with it.
Yeah, she looks real confused.
And I have the same question there as I do with the kiss in Ella West. Why do that? I mean, is this just Hollywood convention that we've got to tick off the box? This is the hero's reward. He gets to kiss the girl.
It feels like he's doing it because he knows he can, and that's gross.
Yeah, I liked it better when we could think of Paladin as the knight in the lyrics from the theme song at the end, where we could think of him as, well, I mean, literally, the song says he's a knight without armor in a savage land. Okay, I want to think of him as honorable. But there is some stuff said, and there is some stuff done here that's just, I realized that the trope of the dirty old man was, it was a thing then, it's a thing now. It was excused more then.
Right.
And, I try to check myself a little bit and make sure that I'm not judging the show through too modern a lens. But look, even in the 50s, there were age of consent laws and things like that, and it's just... No. Just, that element of this story, as much as I want to like it, because the plotting of the story is pretty solid. But it's the relationship angle that just has me going, nope.
Yeah, and, last episode we were talking about ratios and how Gene wanted to have equal number of men and women on the bridge of the Enterprise. And they're like, no, what will we be implying? Paladin says, you're the only woman on board this ship that he's putting her on. I was like, think of the ratios! Think of the ratios! What are you implying here? And so, theoretically speaking, she will be treated appropriately because she's going to be seated at the captain's table every night before dinner, and she's being escorted by the handsome young third officer who is probably much closer to her age than Paladin. But even so, I'm like, you want to talk about what are we implying here? She's the only woman on board. I mean, is it, again, I'm no history or military buff, but is it not a thing still that women don't serve on submarines for that reason?
That I'm not so sure about, because I'm also not bang up to date on my military history, but yeah, it's kind of interesting that we are very careful to plant the information that, basically she's not going to be in steerage. It's also implied that, maybe there is someone for her who is not over the age of 25 by the looks of the young man. And that's much more appropriate than anything she could have been envisioning with Paladin.
To get my facts straight, a cursory Google reveals that women have been serving on submarines in the United States Navy since 2011. So, I mean, that's less than 15 years ago, folks.
Wow. Okay. They're having to do a lot of setup here at the end to make it clear that her voyage should be free of incident, and it just makes me wonder why we couldn't have done that with the rest of the story.
There's another line I want to circle back and talk to about, because he says it in the same scene as good judgment is forced upon us by age and experience. But he says, decency is holding on to the beliefs that keep us in check. Which is a good line, and would continue to be a good line, except that he later says, sometimes circumstances make those beliefs stretch really thin.
Okay, now that's a line that I have notes on for the wrap-up, because I feel like that line that could have been written last week. And so there's meat here. It just feels like we were pining for dessert the whole time instead of concentrating on the meal. There is some really good stuff here. It's just that the emphasis tends to drift back to this other area that is unsettling, which is this implied relationship that just should not be a thing. We shouldn't be worried about shipping these people. We should be worried about whether or not they're going to get out alive. All right, Ashley, we are here at the end of our rough stagecoach ride with Juliet. I think we both have a lot of thoughts on what this story was versus what the story could have been.
Yeah. I think there is some good here. I think if we zero in on Juliet's experience, that she's seen some things at an age, and frankly, no one should see these things.
Yes.
But especially not if you are a minor.
Yeah.
You're not emotionally equipped to handle them, and even adults are not emotionally equipped to handle such trauma. This is a really hard and ugly thing that she's experienced, and now she's on the run from people who are trying to kill her. Not fun. Not my idea of a good time. 10 out of 10 do not recommend.
Exactly.
I also want to know, I have questions about her brother, who's mentioned offhand. How did he get away and not take his sister with him? Like, were they separated at the time? Because if they were together, that makes him a freaking coward, and I don't like it.
Yeah, there is some stuff left off the table there as far as the backstory with her brother, and because it is not a good look if he left her to fend for herself in this situation. Of course,
right.
Depending on how much age difference there is between her and her brother, he may have left to go to school or something. The parents may still have been alive.
Right.
The aunt and uncle still may have been alive. And it just may have been deemed inappropriate for her to follow with him at that time. We don't have enough backstory to make sense of that part of it.
Yeah, it was just something that was kind of like sticking me as I'm watching this. It's like, so why didn't he take her with her? Or with him? So, and again, it could be, as you said, he was away. He might have been at college and then found out, oh snap, my parents are dead. I got to get out of here. Or he may have, he's old enough to have purchased a farm in Hawaii.
Yeah.
So there might be a more significant age difference there than what we're led to believe, but I don't know.
In which case, what would have made sense, and I'm not trying to... This podcast is focused on the works of a specific writer, and so I'm not going to presume to try to rewrite his scripts. But what if the story was... Big Brother hires Paladin to extract her from this terrible situation?
Right. Paladin said he lived there for a year. He could have met Paladin and said, like, oh, by the way, my sister's in a bad spot. I need you to bring her back.
He could have met Big Brother at some point in Hawaii, and then years later, he gets a letter or something saying, I've stopped hearing from my sister. This is where she lives. Go get her. Here's your fee. Here's the check.
Yeah.
And we're off to the races. That would make sense. It's a well-known belief that relationships born from intense situations might not be the most stable. Despite the obvious age difference angle that the whole show seems to dance around, it seems that this is what Paladin is more concerned with in trying to let Juliet down gently, and rightly so. It's part of the formula of the show, and we've discussed this before. Paladin's life is too dangerous for him to have a partner. He's never going to let himself settle down with anyone, not Ella, not Susan, definitely not Juliet, especially because Juliet is, and I'm sorry I can't let this go, still a minor. But anyone Paladin could try to start a future with deserves better than to be attached to someone whose job is so dangerous that there's a pretty good chance of him just not coming home one day. And so I understand that, but still, again, why the big kiss at the end if we're not pursuing anything? But I'm going to chalk that up to Hollywood theatrical and cinematic conventions. I tried really hard to find some kind of Gene messaging in this one, and it's difficult. Because you've got a few reheated Shakespeare leftovers, and some of that is a little bit paint by numbers. And I realize that in the days of trying to crank out scripts for shows that are producing 39 shows a year, some subpar scripts will be inevitable for even the best writers. But there is some good writing here. You flagged this line down earlier. There are certain things in life that are just as easily triggered by careless, thoughtless people. Now, this feels like the first ever trigger warning on American television. Because that whole speech Paladin gives about how easy it is to trip the hair trigger on his gun, and then comparing that to triggering people, that is really modern. That is a very modern piece of writing there. And then he follows this up. Sometimes beliefs can be stretched terribly thin so that a careless act or even a careless word can break through them. Bravo. Okay, so that's the part that I felt like that could have been written last week, not in the middle of last century. On the subject of careless words, I actually found the Pike family more interesting than Juliet being moon-eyed over Paladin. If Jeremiah Pike is anything like the real-life person that he has mentioned alongside Quantrill, he probably granted himself the rank of colonel without asking anyone. And he has basically enlisted his young nephews who... How old do you figure these boys are?
Mid-late 20s, maybe?
Yeah, so they were probably alive during the Civil War. But instead of trying to steer these boys toward a productive life in the Reconstruction era, Jeremiah he's pretty much demanding that they keep fighting the war his side lost. That war is about a decade in the past, judging by where we have figured out Have Gun Will Travel supposedly happens in American history. What's really troubling about this situation is people are raising kids like that now. Spoiling for a rematch of a conflict that is now over a century and a half in the past. And all that is a recipe for more conflict in the future. The people who fought that war are no longer living. The only reason anyone thinks it's their fight now is because that's what they've been told to think. And that is a terrible and dangerous thing to do to a young mind. And so, yeah, Juliet says she is more scared of Jeremiah Pike than either of the younger men. Oh yeah, I'm hip. Our kids have plenty of struggles waiting for them as they grow older, without people telling them to take up arms over a lost cause. And so, yeah, Jeremiah Pike is kind of a scary character. I really wish that this had been an hour-long or a two-parter or something, because almost every angle you look at it, something is crying out to be expanded upon. Yeah, we could have rounded out Juliet better as a character and dug into the angle of her age experience versus her age.
Right. And, thinking about timelines, I was looking at, like, when was the first Juneteenth? June 19th, 1865. So this is early 1870s when this is taking place. So this is 5 or 6 years after that.
Yes.
Civil War is over. And these guys, 5, 6 years on are still, we have stuff to do because we're the Confederacy, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, no, you don't. Sit down. You lost.
Yeah. I mean, it's possible that they actually could have been combatants in their own right in their late teens or something. Mm-hmm. That was not unheard of at that time. But still, it seems like someone should be tapping them on the shoulder and saying, okay, this is over. There's a lot of work to be done. There are a lot of jobs to fill. There are things you can be doing to earn a living in this new world, even if it's not the new world you were expecting. It may not be entirely on Jeremiah Pike, how his nephews have turned out, but he could be a better influence on them. But he's still trying to relitigate that war. It's a very minor element of this episode, but I found that fascinating because, again, it feels like a very recent thing. It feels like a thing that has not gone away. There are elements where it feels like Gene is speaking to the future in this story. unfortunately, they're washed out by other elements that are like, why would you even focus on that so much?
I think you came out a little with some good points in this episode. I was still so bothered by this will they, won't they, weird age difference. You're not a woman, you're a child, you're blah, blah, blah. And then we're going to give, I was completely distracted by all of that I completely missed everything that you just said. So I'm really glad that you brought all of that up. Because that is some good to mine from this episode. Again, my mileage may vary, as, these are the episodes I have seen, the ones that we have covered. But I'm feeling less good about Paladin as somebody to root for. And that may change with other episodes. Nobody is perfect. And we all want our heroes to be perfect and to always get things right and to say and do the right thing all the time. And nobody does that because we're all human beings. I feel like he feels conflicted by the end of the episode. Like, yeah, she might be a woman in a couple months. But, can't let myself get attached. So, gonna go see that redhead who's practically ancient at 25. Or 24, whatever he said. And I feel for Juliet, too, because she's experienced all this trauma. And she doesn't have anybody in her proximity to help her. She's lucky that Paladin happened to jump on the same stage as her. And, he gets her through this mess of these folks chasing after her. But she, while in terms of days on the calendar, is still not an adult, and yet she's experienced so many adult things that she feels conflicted too about how she should be treated. She's like, I've experienced more crap than a lot of other folks, and yet I'm still treated like I don't know anything. And I don't think that's fair to her either. So I zeroed in more on this age versus experience conflict, and I think that's an interesting discussion that I wish we had gotten more of. But for Juliet, I think, in the words of the great philosopher Britney Spears, I'm not a girl, but not yet a woman.
Okay, now there's a reference I was not expecting, but yeah, it brings up a good point. There is some good stuff just waiting to be examined in more depth here. Yet we're kind of falling victim to basically how 50s television, and not just Have Gun Will Travel, and not just Gene Roddenberry, a lot of shows, especially westerns, treated women. They were the damsel to be rescued and or wooed. And it's because this story seems to feel the need to stick to that basic shape that it completely glosses over some stuff that would have been much more interesting and would have been much more future-proofed as well. By concentrating on the push and pull of a relationship that would not be legal then or now, it just seems like the script gets distracted. And there was really good stuff waiting to happen here, and it just wasn't allowed to jostle its way to the front of the story.
Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com.
On the next Gene-ology, the Monster of Moon Ridge. Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David DeCacci.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.